You'd think a man who spent 40 years designing and managing the intricate web of dams, locks, and canals that keep an entire county from flooding could retire in peace. You'd think that buying a house on a lake whose water levels I could manipulate from an app on my phone, would be the ultimate quiet life. I thought so too. My name is Arthur, and I'm a retired hydrological engineer. For 4 decades, my world was fluid dynamics, were gate calibrations, and storm surge modeling. All I wanted was to enjoy the fruits of that labor from my own backyard, on the simple, sturdy dock my father and I built 30 years ago, long before any homeowners association ever existed here. Then Chad Broderick and his Lakeside Estates Beautification Committee came along. The first letter was almost comical in its pomposity, printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock. It informed me that my dock, a structure with every permit in order and grandfathered into county code, did not meet the new aesthetic standards of the community. It was to be demolished and replaced with one of 3 pre-approved designs from Aesthetic Marine Solutions, LLC. The estimated cost was a staggering $25,000. It was less a suggestion and more of a demand wrapped in corporate jargon. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was that they weren't just picking a fight with a retired old man over some weathered planks of wood. They were trying to dictate the terms of the water's edge to the man who literally wrote the rules for the water itself. Have you ever had someone with a little bit of power try to completely upend your life over something utterly nonsensical? This story is for you. It's a story about how a little bit of specialized knowledge, a whole lot of patience, and a perfectly timed system-wide flush can remind a very arrogant man that his authority ends where the real authority begins. They thought my dock was the problem, but they were about to discover the problem was the entire lake. I believe in handling things the civil way first. So, clutching the ridiculously thick letter and a folder containing my original building permits, county easement documents, and the relevant sections of the state waterway code, I attended the next HOA board meeting. It was held in a sterile community clubhouse that smelled of fresh paint and ambition. At the head of a long table sat Chad Broderick, a man whose teeth were as white as his polo shirt and whose tan seemed less a product of the sun and more of a high-end chemical treatment. He oozed the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. I waited my turn, and when called, I calmly laid out my case. I explained that my dock predated the HOA by several decades, was fully compliant with all county and state regulations, and was legally grandfathered in. I presented the paperwork, showing the official stamps and signatures. Mr. Broderick, board members, I said, keeping my voice even. As you can see, this structure is not under your jurisdiction. Your bylaws cannot supersede county law. Chad didn't even look at my documents. He steepled his fingers, leaned back in his chair, and gave me a smile that was pure condescension. Arthur, he began, using my first name as if we were old pals, we appreciate you doing your homework. But Lakeside Estates operates under a new vision, a cohesive, upscale aesthetic. Your rustic pier, while charming in a bygone era, simply doesn't align with the premium brand we're building. The bylaws you agreed to when you bought and give the Architectural Review Committee full authority, he was wrong, of course. I hadn't bought in. I was absorbed in when the HOA was formed around the existing properties. But pointing that out felt like arguing with a brick wall. The authority of your committee ends at the legally defined shoreline, I countered. The water and all structures attached to it are governed by the County Water Management District, he chuckled, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. We'll see about that. The committee's decision stands. You have 60 days to comply. Next on the agenda, I was dismissed. Just like that. My 40 years of expertise, the legal documents in my hand, all waved away by a man who probably thought a weird gate was something you installed in a pasture. The following week, the first fine arrived. $500 for non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. A note at the bottom cheerily informed me that the fine would double every 30 days. I knew then that the civil approach had failed. Chad Broderick didn't want compliance. He wanted control. He had mistaken my quiet retirement for weakness and my calm demeanor for surrender. He was about to learn, in a very public and damp way, just how wrong he was. The HOA's campaign of petty tyranny escalated with alarming speed. A week after the first fine, a professionally printed sign was hammered into the grass near my dock. Violation, It screamed in bold red letters. This structure is not in compliance with Lakeside Estates community standards. Property number 117 my home was now publicly shamed, a scarlet letter for all my neighbors to see. Cars would slow down as they drove by. I could feel the whispers starting. The intimidation was designed to isolate me, to make me feel like the problem. Then came the letters about other things. The color of my mailbox was suddenly out of harmony. The small vegetable garden I kept by the side of the house, hidden from the street, was a prohibited agricultural activity. It was a clear, coordinated attack, all orchestrated by Chad to break my will over the dock. The frustration was immense. It felt like being pecked to death by a flock of very stupid, very determined ducks. But as the pressure mounted, something inside me shifted. The quiet retiree who wanted to fish and watch the sunset began to fade, and the hydrological engineer who designed billion-dollar water infrastructure projects started to come back online. I had spent my life solving complex problems, managing immense forces of nature and bureaucracy. This HOA wasn't a force of nature. It was just Chad Broderick. This wasn't a complex problem. It was a simple matter of jurisdiction wrapped in a whole lot of ego. I sat in my study. The threatening letters spread across my desk. On my computer screens were the schematics of the entire county water grid, a system of canals, reservoirs, and automated locks that I knew better than the back of my own hand. I had designed most of it. I still had administrative access as a senior consultant for the county, a title I kept for occasional emergency oversight. Chad thought he was fighting me over a few boards of wood. He had no idea I could control the very ground his entire Lakeside Estates was built on. A slow, methodical anger began to replace my frustration. It was the same feeling I used to get right before solving a particularly difficult flow rate equation. It was a feeling of clarity and purpose. My fight was no longer just about my dock. It was about a bully using a manufactured rulebook to extort his neighbors. It was about the principle of the thing. And I decided, right then and there, to stop playing defense. It was time to pull out the original blueprints, not just for my dock, but for his entire world. The first step in any strategic plan is a thorough analysis of the terrain. In my case, the terrain was both legal and literal. I spent the next 2 days in my home office, not as a frustrated homeowner, but as the senior hydrology engineer for the Mid-County Water Control District. I pulled up the original satellite surveys from the 1970s, the ones we used when we first planned this reservoir system. I cross-referenced them with the developer's plat maps from when the first phase of this neighborhood was built. Then, I overlaid the HOA's current boundaries. The digital files clicked into place, layers of history and law forming a single, undeniable picture. And that's when I found it. The aha moment. It wasn't just a single piece of information, it was a cascade of them. First, the lake itself. It wasn't created for recreational purposes. It was designated as Reservoir 7B, a critical component of the regional stormwater management system. Its primary purpose was flood control. As such, it was, by state statute, a navigable public waterway under county jurisdiction. The HOA had absolutely no legal authority over the water, the lakebed, or any structures directly connected to the waterway. Their power literally stopped at the high water mark on my lawn. My dock wasn't just grandfathered in. It was categorically exempt from their rules, just as I told them. But it got so much better. I started looking at the plans Chad had been touting for the community's future: a new clubhouse expansion, a waterfront pavilion, and a massive new community marina to house the boats of future residents. He was selling a vision of exclusive waterfront living. I pulled up the permit applications he had filed with the county. They were incomplete, riddled with errors, and, most damningly, they completely misrepresented the nature of the project. He'd classified the marina as a multi-slip private docking facility, a category meant for much smaller structures. He was trying to bypass a full environmental impact study and, more importantly, a hydrological survey to see how the structure would affect water displacement and flow during a major storm event. My system modeling software, which I still had access to, told me exactly what would happen. His planned marina, with its deep pylons and extensive floating structures, would create a bottleneck. In a 100-year storm event, the exact kind of event my systems were built to manage, it would raise the flood stage of the entire reservoir by nearly 3 feet, putting dozens of homes in the lower-lying parts of the neighborhood at risk of severe flooding. He wasn't just breaking some aesthetic bylaws. His grand vision was actively endangering the very community he claimed to be improving. And the cherry on top? Aesthetic Marine Solutions, LLC, the company whose docks were the only ones approved by the committee, was a shell corporation. A quick search of state business records showed its sole registered agent was a holding company owned by Chad Broderick's wife. He wasn't just a bully. He was a con artist using the HOA to line his own pockets while putting his neighbors' homes in jeopardy. I leaned back in my chair, a cold, calm certainty settling over me. I now had everything I needed. Chad's little kingdom was built on a foundation of ignorance and deceit, and I was the one man who had the blueprints to its demolition. With the evidence compiled, the strategy began to form in my mind, elegant and efficient, like a perfectly balanced hydraulic system. This would not be a single, angry confrontation. It would be a meticulous, multi-pronged operation designed to dismantle Chad's authority from every conceivable angle. My objective wasn't just to save my dock. It was to expose the fraud, correct the public record, and ensure this kind of overreach could never happen again. First, the legal front. I engaged a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in property and administrative law. I didn't need her to fight a long battle. I just needed her to format my findings into an ironclad cease and desist letter. I provided her with the statutes, the plat maps, the county codes I had helped write. She was giddy. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her eyes gleaming as she reviewed the documents. "This is the most airtight case of jurisdictional overreach I have ever seen. We're not just telling them to stop. We're informing them of the laws they've already broken." Second, the bureaucratic front. I was no longer acting as a resident, but as a concerned expert. I drafted 3 separate, detailed reports. The first went to the County Planning and Zoning Commission, outlining the gross misrepresentations in Chad's marina application and the clear violation of land use codes. The second went to the Department of Environmental Protection, detailing the unapproved dredging and construction that would be required and the potential for habitat disruption. The third, and most critical, went to my old colleagues at the Mid-County Water Control District. It was a formal hydrological assessment of the proposed marina, complete with flow models and floodplain analysis, concluding that the project posed a significant and unacceptable risk to public safety and the integrity of the Reservoir 7B system. I wasn't just tattling. I was filing official expert testimony that would trigger mandatory investigations and immediate stop work orders. And then there was the masterstroke, the public unveiling. My plan needed a stage, a moment of maximum impact. As if on cue, the next HOA newsletter arrived. In it, Chad announced the Lakeside Estates vision for the future gala, a grand event to be held in 2 weeks on a large floating platform moored near the proposed marina site. He would be unveiling the architectural renderings to the entire community, celebrating the new era of exclusive living. It was perfect. It was a stage built by his own ego. I opened my work calendar and logged into the county's water management control system. I had the authority to schedule routine maintenance, system tests, and emergency procedures. I navigated to the control module for Reservoir 7B. With a few clicks, I scheduled a system-wide sluice gate calibration and emergency drawdown test for the exact date and time of Chad's gala. It was a completely legitimate, if rarely performed, procedure required to test the functionality of the emergency systems that prevent catastrophic dam failure. It was also going to lower the lake's water level by 4 vertical feet in the space of about 2 hours. Chad had chosen his stage. I was about to pull it right out from under him. The next 2 weeks were a study in contrast. On the surface, I was the recalcitrant resident, ignoring the escalating fines and the increasingly threatening letters from the HOA's lawyer. I let the violation sign on my lawn stand as a monument to their arrogance. I nodded politely to neighbors who looked at me with a mixture of pity and disapproval. Internally, however, my plan was moving forward with the silent, unstoppable force of a rising tide. The responses from the county departments began to trickle in, each one a small victory. The Planning Commission sent a certified letter to the HOA, informing them that the marina application was being suspended pending a full review due to significant discrepancies. The Department of Environmental Protection scheduled a site inspection, citing concerns of unpermitted waterway alteration, and my friends at the Water Control District? They were horrified by my report. My old boss called me personally. "Arthur, is this for real? Did this guy really think he could build a subdivision in a primary spillway?" He confirmed that my scheduled drawdown test was not only approved, but now considered critically necessary to establish a new baseline before any further construction in the area could even be considered. The bureaucratic gears were turning, grinding slowly but surely towards Chad Broderick. Meanwhile, Chad was a whirlwind of self-congratulation. He was everywhere, supervising the setup of the event platform on the lake, glad-handing residents, talking about the exclusive lifestyle investment their community was becoming. He saw my silence as capitulation. He saw the county's inquiries as mere red tape that his expensive lawyers could handle. His confidence was a spectacle to behold. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, admiring the fine craftsmanship of the wood. The final notice from the HOA arrived 3 days before the gala. It was delivered by a courier, a thick packet of legal threats. They were giving me 72 hours to sign a compliance agreement and begin demolition of my dock, or they would file for a court-ordered injunction and place a lien on my property for the accumulated fines, which had now ballooned to several $1,000s. I read the letter, a faint smile on my face, and placed it neatly on top of the growing stack of evidence on my desk. They were trying to corner me, to force my hand before I could react. They had no idea that all my pieces were already in place. The game was already over. All that remained was the checkmate. I spent the evening before the gala making a few quiet phone calls to a couple of old neighbors, people who had been here as long as I had, and remembered what the community was like before Chad's reign. I didn't give them details. I just said, "If you have a boat in the water, you might want to double-check your mooring lines tomorrow afternoon. The county is doing some testing, and the water level might fluctuate a bit." It was the only warning I gave. For everyone else, the show was about to begin. The day of the gala was beautiful, a perfect late spring afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the lake shimmered, placid and unsuspecting. I watched from my porch as the final preparations were made. White tents were erected on the shore. A catering crew set up tables laden with food and drink. Residents, dressed in their best resort wear, began to trickle in, drawn by the promise of champagne and Chad's grand vision. The centerpiece of the event was the large floating stage, anchored a good 50 feet from the shore, accessible by a charming wooden gangplank. On it stood a lectern and several large easels draped in white cloth, ready to reveal the architectural renderings of the marina. Chad was in his element, a king surveying his domain. He wore a pastel blazer, no socks, and an expression of supreme satisfaction. I checked the time on my phone. 3:45 p.m. The drawdown test was scheduled to begin its automated sequence in precisely 15 minutes. I put on a simple navy blue blazer, picked up the thick leather-bound portfolio from my desk, and took a leisurely stroll down the community path toward the festivities. I didn't look like a man on his way to a battle. I looked like any other resident curious about the future of the neighborhood. I arrived just as Chad was taking the stage to a smattering of polite applause. He tapped the microphone, and his amplified voice boomed across the water. "Welcome, friends. Welcome to the future of Lakeside Estates," he began, launching into a soaring speech about property values, exclusive amenities, and community excellence. I found a spot near the back, by the shoreline, and simply waited. At 4 p.m., nothing happened. Not at first. The changes were imperceptible. A few hundred miles away, a series of automated commands were being sent from the central county server. Massive, unseen gears began to turn deep underwater. The main sluice gate at the reservoir's southern dam, a concrete and steel behemoth the size of a house, began to open, inch by inch. The initial outflow was small, a mere increase in the river's current downstream. But the sequence was progressive. At 4:10 p.m., the secondary gates began to open. Now the change was becoming noticeable, if you knew what to look for. The water around the base of the tents seemed to be just a little farther away. A few pebbles on the shoreline that had been wet were now dry. At 4:20 p.m., as Chad was waxing poetic about the unparalleled waterfront experience, the first audible sign appeared. A gentle, collective sigh from the dozens of boats moored at the community docks. Their lines, once taut, were now slackening, and the boats settled lower. Then, the floating stage itself gave a soft lurch. Chad paused, a flicker of confusion on his face, but he carried on. By 4:30 p.m., there was no denying it. The water was rapidly receding. A dark, muddy ring began to appear around the entire circumference of the lake. The charming gangplank to the stage was now angled steeply downward. The stage itself was listing slightly to one side. The murmuring among the crowd grew from a whisper to an anxious buzz. Chad's confident speech faltered. "Just a minor fluctuation, folks," he stammered, but his eyes were wide with panic. The grand unveiling was turning into a grand disaster. The climax came at 4:37 p.m. With a final, groaning shudder, the magnificent floating stage, Chad's chosen throne, grounded itself in the thick, pungent mud of the exposed lake bed. It tilted at a comical 15-degree angle, sending the champagne bucket sliding and crashing to the floor. The draped easels tipped over like dominoes. Chad stumbled, catching himself on the lectern, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The idyllic waterfront scene had vanished, replaced by an expanse of smelly, fly-covered muck. Boats hung awkwardly from their docks, their keels exposed, their lines straining. The beautiful lakeside estates looked like a bathtub after the drain had been pulled. Panic gave way to anger among the residents. "What's happening? My boat? What's going on with the lake?" Chad, trapped on his crooked stage, had no answers. He just stood there, speechless, his grand vision literally sinking into the mud. That was my cue. I walked forward, my portfolio held firmly under my arm. As I reached the shoreline, a county vehicle, the official seal of the Water Control District emblazoned on its side, pulled up. Two uniformed officials stepped out, my old boss, Mark, and the county's chief code enforcement officer. They had received my invitations. I strode to the edge of the newly formed mudflat, where the crowd was gathered in stunned confusion. I didn't need a microphone. My voice, calm and steady, cut through the noise. "This is a scheduled and necessary emergency drawdown test of Reservoir 7B, I announced. "It is being conducted by the Mid-County Water Control District to ensure the integrity of the flood control systems that protect this entire valley." All eyes turned to me. Chad, still on his tilted stage, stared as if he'd seen a ghost. "Who the hell are you?" he managed to yell, his voice cracking. I allowed myself a small, tight smile. "I'm Arthur Peterson," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the stunned silence. "I'm the consulting hydrological engineer for the district. I designed this reservoir, and I scheduled this test." I then turned my attention to the two county officials. "Mark, Officer Jennings, thank you for coming." I opened my portfolio. I handed a thick document to Officer Jennings. "This is a formal stop work order for the illegal and unpermitted marina project proposed for this site, which, as my report shows, poses a significant flood risk to the community." I handed another document to Mark. "And this is for Mr. Broderick and the HOA board." I turned back to face the crowd, holding up the last document so all could see. "This is a cease and desist letter, demanding the HOA immediately halt its illegal attempts to regulate a public waterway and rescind all fines related to structures, such as my dock, that fall under the exclusive jurisdiction of the county." The collective gasp from the residents was more satisfying than any applause. I proceeded to lay it all out, my voice never rising, each statement a carefully placed stone building a wall of irrefutable fact. "For the past several months," I began, addressing my neighbors, "your HOA board, led by Mr. Broderick, has been operating under the false pretense that it has authority over this lake. It does not. This is a public utility, not a private amenity." I gestured to the exposed, muddy lake bed. "This is not a playground. It's a piece of critical infrastructure." I then turned to the most damning revelation. "Furthermore, the pre-approved dock designs you were being pressured to purchase at exorbitant prices are from a company called Aesthetic Marine Solutions." I paused, letting the name hang in the air. "A company that, public records show, is wholly owned by Mr. Broderick's wife. He wasn't improving the community. He was using the HOA bylaws to run a racket and force you to buy his products." A wave of angry shouts erupted from the crowd. People were turning on Chad, who was now trying to scramble off the muddy, tilted stage, his expensive loafers sinking into the muck. The code enforcement officer was already there to meet him, stop work order in hand. My old boss, Mark, stepped forward. "Mr. Peterson is correct," he announced in an official tone. The Water Control District is taking this matter very seriously. An immediate moratorium is being placed on all new construction along this shoreline, pending a full safety and regulatory review. The HOA will be subject to significant fines for its unauthorized attempts to control this waterway. The downfall was swift and total. Chad Broderick, covered in mud and humiliation, was publicly served with the legal documents. His authority evaporated in an instant. The residents, once his subjects, were now a furious mob, realizing they had been deceived, extorted, and endangered. They swarmed the other board members, demanding answers, demanding resignations. The gala was over. The beautiful vision had been revealed as a dangerous fraud. As the county officials took statements and the HOA board dissolved into chaos, I simply stood back and watched. My personal fight over my dock had become a public liberation for the entire community. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't filed a lawsuit. I had simply used the truth, amplified by the undeniable reality of a half-empty lake. Chad thought the fight was about aesthetics. He never understood that it was about jurisdiction. He tried to control a few planks of wood, and in response, I had taken away the water that gave his entire kingdom its value. The aftermath was even more thorough than I had anticipated. Chad Broderick's reign ended not with a whimper, but with a series of resounding legal crashes. The county fined him personally for the fraudulent permit applications, and the Water Control District levied a massive fine against the HOA for interfering with a public waterway, a fine the residents promptly voted to cover by suing Chad and the complicit board members directly. Stripped of his presidency and facing multiple lawsuits, including a class action suit from homeowners for fraud and endangerment, he sold his house at a loss within 3 months and disappeared from the community. Aesthetic Marine Solutions, LLC was dissolved, and the story of the gala in the mud became a local legend, a cautionary tale about arrogance and overreach. The HOA was completely restructured. The old, draconian bylaws were purged, and a new board, composed of reasonable, long-term residents, was elected. Their first official act was to issue a public, written apology to me and to rescind every fine that had ever been levied against me. They even included a gift certificate to my favorite local restaurant. The violation sign on my lawn was removed by the new board president herself. The positive changes rippled throughout the community. With the knowledge that the lake was a public resource, residents worked with the county to establish better guidelines for its use, ensuring safety and environmental protection without the aesthetic tyranny of the old regime. My expertise was suddenly in demand, and I volunteered to head a new community oversight committee, acting as a liaison with the Water District. We were a community again, not a kingdom. I learned a valuable lesson through it all. I had wanted a quiet retirement, to be left alone. But I realized that peace isn't a passive state. Sometimes it has to be actively defended. My specialized knowledge wasn't just a tool from my old job, it was a responsibility. When someone in a position of power tries to bully others, hiding behind a thin veil of rules they wrote themselves, the most effective response is not to argue within their framework, but to demolish the framework itself with a larger, more fundamental truth. For anyone out there facing a similar battle with a petty tyrant, whether it's in an HOA, an office, or anywhere else, remember this. They rely on you not knowing the bigger picture. Do your homework. Find the jurisdictional blueprint they're ignoring. Their power is often built on a foundation of sand, and all it might take to wash it away is a little bit of knowledge and the will to turn on the water. Today, I'm sitting on my dock, the same sturdy, weathered dock my father and I built. The lake is full again, shimmering peacefully. My fishing line is in the water, and a quiet sense of satisfaction has settled over me. I have my peace, and it's all the sweeter because it was earned. Justice, much like water, always finds its level.